Hello, my name is Vitania Quinlan, and I'm going to be looking at a philosophical model analysis of two theorists. These two theorists are Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Jane Addams. My thesis is that Jane Addams was a dynamic, intentional, community-based, action-oriented pragmatist in comparison to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is speculative and romanticized. Looking at the background at the times that these occurred, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was part of the Enlightenment period. His research sought to explain the everyday occurrences, and he was heavily dependent on the scientific method and challenging the status quo that was set by the church. This is according to Gutek 2011. Jane Addams, on the other hand, was part of the progressive era. This is post-Civil War, where you have a lot of migration from what used to be plantations and immigrants moving in from Europe. Her ideology was rooted in that of Protestant and therefore had a direct impact on her educational policies. Looking at Rousseau, there were three major things to consider. One was his early life experiences, and another were the major influences that led to the writing of the book Emile. His mother died during childbirth. He was raised by a father who was not loving and affectionate, and he was eventually abandoned by that father and raised by a tutor. His work, basically, of Emile led to what the ideal result of raising a child would be as a good citizen. He wanted that person to be a good father, a good brother, a good friend. Addams, on the other hand, also had three major things to consider in terms of her upbringing, her influences that resulted in her work at the Hull House. Addams was raised by her father. Her mother died when she was a young age. However, she had a stepmother who was also a doctor, who had a major influence on her life and the choices that she made as she grew up. Heavily dependent on a Protestant upbringing, she had the idea of a socialized democracy where you have education, rights, and equality for all. It is this concept of socialized democracy that led to socialized education and her desire to do community-driven needs and services and eventually be known as the first social worker of America. The practices that both of them, the theories that led to practice, Rousseau was very influential in the work of Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi so much so admired him that he named his child after Rousseau. The work of Pestalozzi in turn fed into Froebel, who was the founder of kindergarten. Addams, it was really hard to find who influenced the work of Addams, especially since her work was shaped by service. However, she worked very closely with John Dewey and George Herbert Mead, who was the founder of the symbolic interactionism theory. According to Wendler, if you look at both of the work and writings of Addams and that of Mead, you'll see a lot of similarities between the two. John Dewey also did a lot of research in Chicago that was linked to the Hull House and the shaping later on of his theories. Diversity, both theories really looked forward to education for all. However, Rousseau looked at curriculum that evolved from nature. He wanted the truth and the inspiration of nature to be involved in the curriculum. He also wanted the scientific method to be a part of that. Addams was into cross-cultural learning. She believed in socialized education. For her, she felt that interaction and engagement with a variety of people led to a more complete and thorough whole person. It was that connection and that integration that led to her being able to meet those community needs. When we look at the critical analysis, Rousseau, even though Pestalozzi was one of his greatest followers, inspired by his work, he was also one of the critics that I considered his key critic. He implemented everything that Rousseau had in his books. And as a result, he came out in the end and said that although he was on the right track, he also needed to look at a systematic approach that had psychological elements considered. Maria Montessori was another critic, again, agreeing with the patterns of development that Rousseau had, but also calling him speculative and not clinical in his observations. Addams, one of her critics, not so much on theory and practice, was John Dewey. He had issues with some of the things that Addams stood up for, such as social issues, World War I, publicly speaking out against her perspective, and really Adams was described as absolute. So either you did it her way or you didn't do it at all. Implications is that Jane Addams was embedded in action research. Her work was driven from the needs of those that she served. It was through collaboration, it was through action that she was able to serve and meet the needs of those. Jean Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, was a philosopher. He was full of ideas, no action. Yes, his ideas led to great work by Pestalozzi, Frugel, and later even Piaget. However, that was not reflected in his book because he didn't even put it into practice. So overall, those are the two theorists that I looked at, the work, how it impacted, and eventually led to other researchers.